Hello and welcome to this webinar on negatives. If you've only ever considered photographs to be digital, the concept of a negative may be an alien one, but for much of photographic history, most photographs were produced by a two-step negative-positive process. How did this come about? Well, we tend to imagine that the early inventors of photography only had a chemistry set which they dabbled with until they found something that would be changed and fixed on exposure to light. We tend to forget that they were working against the context of their time and that there were often other influences upon them. I was fortunate enough to work with the Nice 4 Niepce photographs, the earliest photographs in the world, as part of a joint project between the Getty Conservation Institute and the National Science and Media Museum. And it was a great project, and it was fascinating to see how the seeds of photography were sown and how significant printing was as an influence on some of the early developments in photography. This was key to the idea that you had a master version of an image from which multiple images could be made. In traditional printing, that source or master version is the printing plate, and in photography it's the negative. It was William Henry Fox Talbot, an Englishman, and not Daguerre, a French colleague of Niepce's, who took this idea and ran with it after Niepce's death. Daguerre, for all the finesse of his daguerreotype process, had created a direct positive process which formed a unique final image directly in the camera. Daguerre envisaged photographs as being more like prestigious miniature paintings, and this turned out to be an evolutionary dead end. It was Niepce and Fox Talbot, who both had an interest in printing, who foresaw correctly the significance of the two-stage negative-positive process. Talbot had first recorded his concept of how a negative process would work in 1835, but it was Sir John Herschel who introduced the terms negative and positive in 1839. When light hits silver salt, silver is formed, which is dark, and this means that light areas in an object being photographed appear dark in the first generation or negative image. The way to correct this was to enable light to pass through this image or mask onto a second light-sensitive surface to form a second generation image which will be positive. Fox Talbot's first process was the photogenic drawing, not a drawing at all but a silver image on paper. However, at this stage he didn't have a process for a negative from which to make a positive print. The first images were created by using objects placed directly on the surface of the paper to act as a mask for making photograms. However, in 1841, Talbot patented his first negative process, the calotype. And the calotype was a silver process, but as I mentioned in a previous webinar, the properties of silver images can vary depending on how they're made, giving rise to different shapes and sizes of silver particle, and in turn giving different hues and levels of contrast. The calotype process produced what is known as a physically developed silver image, meaning that there was a secondary source of silver deposited during a development stage on the silver image. This made for bigger round particles, and the importance of this was that you got a more contrasty, punchy sort of image. And with every generation of image you can lose something, so you need a stronger negative to produce the print. Now, to make a calotype, a good quality writing paper was coated with silver nitrate and then potassium iodide, which react to form light-sensitive silver iodide. The paper was further sensitised by washing it with a mixture of silver nitrate and gallic acid solutions. After exposure, development was carried out with the same solution again. The paper was finally fixed in sodium thiosulfate, washed and dried. And if you're wondering how any of this might be useful as a translucent negative, it was then waxed so light would then pass through it. And this example you can see here is an image of a wax paper negative which I took during a survey. It's by Captain Linnaeus Tripe of the ship the Duke of Wellington in the 1850s. And you can even see at this early stage that watercolours have been used for retouching. To avoid confusion, it's worth saying that the print process used for making positives from these wax paper negatives was usually the salted paper print, which I talked about in the prints video. However, it wasn't unknown for them to use the calotype process for prints, although obviously not waxed. This is the other side of the negative by Captain Linnaeus Tripe. And you might wonder at this stage if you can actually get a good enough print from a wax paper negative. And for most purposes, contact printed at the same size, a print can be surprisingly good, with just a slightly mottled appearance on close inspection. Here we've got a detail from a much later print, which was made from a wax paper negative, and you can see here that you can see the effect of the mottling from the negative. There was a further tweak to the wax paper negative process in 1851, which involved waxing the paper first prior to sensitisation, but essentially all wax paper negatives involve a physically developed silver image and a wax coating. Clearly there were limitations to the clarity of the final image that could be obtained from a wax paper negative, as you've seen, and so there was a movement towards using glass as a support. An albumen on glass process was invented in 1847 using silver halide again, but it required a long exposure time of minutes and so was generally used for landscapes. And it also meant that because of this, the paper negative process continued to overlap with it to some extent. However, they were both superseded by the wet collodion process, which was invented by Frederick Scott Archer, which was to become the workhorse of 19th century photography. In this process, the emulsion was collodion, a mixture of gun cotton in ether and alcohol. It was known as the wet collodion process because the plate had to be exposed and processed while it was still wet. The plate was hand coated, giving the coating an uneven quality towards the edge of the plate, and the photographer's thumbprint is often visible in the corner. Collodion plates were usually varnished, often with a natural resin such as shellac or sandarac, and this too may ripple or peter out at the edge of the plate. And I should say that albumen plates were often not varnished. Here you can see some examples of the characteristic effects. Here you've got the ripples in the emulsion and the varnish at the edge of the plate. And in this one you've got an effect known as a comet, which was when a bit of dust or an impurity settled on the surface of the plate, causing the emulsion or varnish to sort of drag in that characteristic way. The wet collodion negative was the natural counterpart of the albumen print, and together they dominated 19th century photography. And remember that this was a contact printing process with no enlargement, and so you needed negatives the same size as the final print. So unless the photographer was doing studio photography, they had to transport all the chemicals, darkroom and large plates with them. It was a remarkable achievement when you consider that most landscape travel and photojournalistic photography from the mid to fairly late 19th century was made in this way. A number of the photographers recorded the difficulties of their work. Roger Fenton, who is famous for his work as a photojournalist in the Crimea, took 700 plates with him, packed in grooved boxes and then in chests. His transport and darkroom and accommodation was all in a former Canterbury wine merchant's van, which you can see here. This is Marcus Sparling, his assistant. He described the practicalities in a paper to the Royal Photographic Society after returning. It was difficult in the great heats to clean the glass plates properly. When the heat was intense, impurities upon the glass, which in a lower temperature would have been of no detriment, became centres of chemical action and caused spots or streaks in the negative picture. I need not speak of the physical exhaustion which I experienced in working in my van in this period. The van grew so hot at noon as to burn the hand when touched. As soon as the door closed to commence preparation of a plate, perspiration started from every pore. I should not forget that it was at this time that a plague of flies commenced. Before preparing the plate, the first thing to be done was to battle with them for possession of the place, the necessary buffeting with handkerchiefs and towels having taken place, and the intruders being expelled. The moment the last one was out, the door had to be rapidly closed for fear of a fresh invasion, and then some time allowed for the dust thus raised to settle before coating a plate. So I think we get some idea of how difficult it was. And here we have Nina, which is a converted ambulance used by Jack Lowe, a modern day wet collodion photographer, for travelling around the British Isles and Ireland to photograph the Royal National Lifeboat stations. And this is exactly the same purpose. It's a travelling darkroom, although I don't think Jack actually sleeps in it. Obviously there were logistical problems using a wet emulsion, and although there was some effort to use a dry collodion emulsion, it was much less sensitive. In the 1870s, progress was made with the gelatin emulsion, and in 1878 the improved process was published in the British Journal of Photography by Charles Bennett. This emulsion had a much faster exposure time of fractions of a second, and the emulsion was machine coated and was not varnished, so it's completely smooth with no ripples or finger marks, and any abrasion in the corners is usually due to the plate holder in the camera. In press collections it's not unusual to find masking paint, or you can sometimes find paper tape stuck onto the emulsion to act as a mask. These would usually be considered integral parts of the photograph. The image is formed with a chemical developer using the developed out process which I explained in my previous video on prints. Therefore you get the same types of silver image deterioration, tarnishing and mirroring that you see in developed out prints. Here you can see the edge deterioration caused by the fact that negatives are normally stored next to each other, so air carrying pollutants penetrates at the edges. Sometimes you get localised deterioration known as redox spots, as you can see here, which is where silver has been reduced and oxidised in localised areas. A lot of the problems of gelatin glass plate negatives are associated with poor storage conditions, either materials, environment or both. They were supplied by the manufacturer in boxes, often with processing information on a label on the lid, and photographers often reused these and other poor enclosure materials with the resulting consequences. So here you've got a craft paper enclosure that's been pulled back from the negative, and you can see the silver deterioration underneath, which has been caused by the craft paper enclosure. Here we've got an example of a negative which has been stored in this sort of semi-transparent paper which is known as glassine paper, and the enclosures were too big for the box, so the glassine paper has been folded over and then taped with a pressure sensitive sticky tape, and when that enclosure has been pulled back you can see that the gases from the tape, or from the adhesive for the tape, have diffused through the paper enclosure and reacted with the silver in the emulsion, causing the formation of silver sulfide, which is this sort of yellowish greenish compound that you can see, and that damage is irreversible. Gelatin glass plate negatives generally suffer more from silver deterioration than wet collodion negatives due to not being varnished and being more permeable to high humidity. However, the deterioration will only appear on prints made from deteriorated negatives if the negatives are quite badly deteriorated. Both types of negative, the gelatin glass plate negative and the wet collodion negative, are vulnerable to glass deterioration, and this is a typical example of glass deterioration in a gelatin glass plate negative, where the glass appears to go frosted and the gelatin emulsion just flakes away and separates. In the case of wet collodion negatives, it can cause varnishes to discolour and the emulsion in extreme conditions to go tacky, although that's quite unusual. Obviously, negatives on glass can break, and glass in photography is a specialist area of mine, and it's a whole other course, but suffice to say that there are two approaches to broken glass negatives: either making a purpose-made housing which holds all the parts in place, or repairing the negative itself, and each has pros and cons. Now obviously glass is not easy to handle in some ways or to transport, and so there was a movement towards using film. And the first film that was successfully used in photography was cellulose nitrate, and it was also used for motion picture film. It was introduced in 1889 by Kodak, but most cellulose nitrate negatives date from the 20th century. There was a considerable overlap with glass, and glass appears in press collections up until the 1970s. Different formats or sizes of cellulose nitrate negatives were introduced and ceased to be produced at different times, but cellulose nitrate generally ceased to be produced after 1950, although old film stock continued to be used in small amounts just after this. And from gelatin glass plates onwards, mainstream negative processes all use gelatin emulsions. Now, for identification purposes, the aim of identifying cellulose nitrate is usually to distinguish it from cellulose acetate, which we haven't talked about yet. Notch codes can be used for pre-1949 Kodak sheet film where they are present. So to look at the notch codes, you look at the sheet film from the emulsion side with any notches along the top edge. And there may be several notches, but look at the one that's nearest the right corner, the top right corner. And if it is a V shape, it indicates nitrate, and if it is a U shape, it indicates cellulose acetate. Cellulose acetate is often identified by being edge-printed safety film, as seen here. This is not found on a cellulose nitrate film. Chemical tests and infrared spectroscopy will distinguish between the two, but these are not tests for the layman and not particularly quick or cheap to do. Negatives turn up in significant numbers quite frequently, and collections are often a mixture of both supports, often overlapping for the same time periods. So for most collections, identification will be mostly using the visual indicators that I've just mentioned, and circumstantial evidence such as the date and format, and the condition can also be a major guide. So here we have some cellulose nitrate negatives in fairly reasonable condition from late 1917 and early 1918. In the early stages of deterioration, nitrate goes yellowish and there's some mirroring of the silver in the emulsion. This is followed by stickiness and blocking together and an amber warm brown colour. Finally, the nitrate will sort of stick together, particularly if it's with other film material, as a block, and you can see that it will become brittle and often shards will break away, and sometimes the film becomes powdery. Also, the later stages can be accompanied by a camphorous smell, and you can see a pretty graphic illustration here of what can happen. Okay. This is where people sometimes get muddled if they've vaguely heard about nitrate being a problem, and they lump together what are two different things. So what I've described so far is the standard way that cellulose nitrate may deteriorate. There's another property of cellulose nitrate, which is the relatively low temperature at which it can catch fire when compared with other film bases. In this context, it produces its own oxygen, which means it burns very quickly and is hard to extinguish. The temperature at which it catches fire is lowest for film, which is in the poorest condition, and the oft quoted figure is 38 degrees centigrade at the end point of deterioration. However, some institutions with research facilities have tried under safe conditions with a small sample to repeat this and have been unable to get very near that temperature. It's worth noting that the film will be unusable in the condition we are talking about, so it may well already have been disposed of in collections. So if we consider the first scenario, the standard way it deteriorates before it reaches the flammable temperature, is it unstable? Well, you have to think that this film base was manufactured and widely used for about 60 years. If it easily turned orange, got sticky and smelt camphorous and caught fire, I think we can safely say that people wouldn't have used it. Therefore, we have to presume that the vast majority of the time it didn't. And I can just remember photojournalists who used to say that they liked working with nitrate in the past. Cellulose nitrate was also used for motion picture film, which was passed through a projector, which would have been fairly hot, and kept in rolls, so that tested it much more, but it still continued to be used for that too until 1951. And this echoes what I've seen, which is that most of the time cellulose nitrate is found in good condition. However, there are isolated examples when it's found in very poor condition and often unusable, and this is usually related to being kept in a very poor environment at some point in its history. The deterioration is autocatalytic, so the byproducts of deterioration feed back into further deterioration. And so when environmental conditions are good, this will be much less of a problem than where environmental conditions are poor and the state of the film is poor, when everything will be amplified. The gases it gives off during deterioration are acidic and so may damage adjacent photographic material. For film which has been kept in poor conditions, enclosures may be brittle and discoloured. Gloves such as polyethylene or nitrile gloves should be worn when handling nitrate film, particularly when it's deteriorated. However, one or two negatives in good condition, stored at a cool temperature in a well-ventilated space and away from sources of ignition or heat such as hot water pipes, radiators, light fittings or opposite sunny windows, will present a much reduced risk of associated fire or deterioration by comparison. Insurance policies may stipulate that cellulose nitrate is either not kept on a premises or that purpose-made storage is supplied appropriate to the quantity. Sometimes provision can be made to keep cellulose nitrate, or it can be transferred to an institution with appropriate storage conditions. In cases where there is material beyond use, it cannot be disposed of with ordinary waste, and you should contact the local council to make suitable arrangements. Many of our most precious negatives are on cellulose nitrate, and a holistic management and conservation approach needs to take this and the health and safety factors into consideration. The next film base to be introduced was cellulose acetate, or sometimes known as safety film, which was first used for negatives in the 1920s, and it's still in use today, although it's increasingly been supplanted by polyester. As I mentioned before, safety film is sometimes printed on the edge of the film, and a U-shaped notch nearest the right corner viewed from the emulsion side indicates cellulose acetate. Cellulose acetate encompasses some different subgroups, but what you need to know is that your problems are likely to occur with cellulose acetate from the 1950s and sometimes very early 1960s. In a mixed photographic collection, this is quite likely to be the material showing some of the most pronounced deterioration. In the early stages of deterioration, the film undulates particularly around the edges. It may also develop a patchy blue discoloration, and sometimes one occurs first, sometimes the other. But this is due to the cellulose acetate beginning to break down and the acetyl side groups forming acetic acid, which increases the level of acidity. This causes some dyes, which are known as anti-halation dyes, which are normally invisible to the human eye, to become blue or occasionally pink. And people sometimes confuse this with mould because it can appear patchy. You're also likely to notice this smell of vinegar or acetic acid at this point, which can be very obvious in a collection of deteriorating acetate, hence the name which is often used to describe this sort of deterioration of vinegar syndrome. The waviness corresponds with the stresses in the film as the film base shrinks and the emulsion on one side and the gelatin anti-curl layer on the other stay the same size. As the film base shrinks further, wrinkles in the emulsion and anti-curl layer form, as you can see here. It's quite dramatic, and plasticizers in the film base, often phthalates, tend to leach out, and they leach out of the film base and often collect under blisters as crystals or liquid, or rise to the surface, giving it a sort of oily effect. And this can be the final result. By this stage there may be no smell as all the acetic acid has dispersed and the film is extremely brittle. This is a case of where prevention is much better than trying to treat the result. In collections with this era of material, if you see one negative like this, it's very unlikely to be the only one. Treatment to separate the emulsion from its support is laborious and not always successful, so avoiding the problem in the first place is much better. And again, deterioration is autocatalytic, and so the effect of poor condition and poor storage is amplified. Nitrile gloves should be worn for handling, particularly where film is in poor condition. You will be pleased to know that the formulation of cellulose acetate was tweaked after the experience of the 1950s, and more modern cellulose acetate tends to be much more stable. So finally we get to polyester, some good news from the stability point of view, and polyester is unlikely to deteriorate. It was introduced in the 1950s, initially for things such as X-rays where dimensional stability was important, and in the 1960s it began to be used for sheet film and then also for amateur film, and it continues to be used alongside more stable cellulose acetate. And as polyester tends to have been used after the problematic era of cellulose acetate, there's usually less need to identify it. However, to identify it, there is a test using polarizing filters. In a non-image area of the film, if it's passed between two crossed polarizing filters, that means that they're sort of at right angles, so they block all the light passing through. You will see a sort of pink and green interference colours, and you can see that in this slide. This is just a sheet of polyester, not film, it's just plain polyester, but it shows you very clearly here the green and pink colours, interference colours on the right hand side. I haven't had time today to include colour chromogenic negatives. I thought it was worth going into more detail about the film bases. However, chromogenic negatives mirror the development of chromogenic prints as far as the dyes are concerned, and share many of the same issues of stability of dyes. They also have gelatin emulsion, so they share that in common with a number of photographic processes, and also the black and white film negatives, and they share issues of the film bases with black and white negatives again. So it's possible to extrapolate to some extent to anticipate where the deterioration and hence conservation effort ought to be focused. I hope that the introduction to the types of negatives and their properties was useful. In the next video we will be looking at the preservation and care of photographs.